policy and science, and I'm going to talk about that again today, but talking about the fact that there are lots of priorities with policy, and of course lots of reasons why policy moves slower than science does sometimes, and highlighted that with a late-breaking example from the Clean Water Act and Supreme Court in a major decision that they made a couple weeks ago. I also talked about the fact that some sediment transport by streams is okay and it's even natural, and that fits into my ecosystem perspectives that I'll be talking about a bit more today. And overall, I summed up by saying that reducing the speed of water leaving pervious surfaces is the most effective method for dealing with stormwater management. But of course, those projects can take up a lot of space. And so I'm going to be moving on today to talk about how data can help. And so taking a very data-driven approach today, but something I don't think that this will be a boring data-driven approach, but to show you really how some of the really exciting, unexpected things that you can find if you look at things quantitatively, and why data that we collect right now may not be sufficient to evaluate effectiveness in a lot of cases. And I would argue that spending more on data now can save you a lot of money later. We'll get into some examples of that. So first of all, I talked about this, I name dropped this last week, but I thought I would give some additional details about what is a wicked problem. And this is a great book, Wicked Environmental Problems is a great book about this, but this figure over on the right kind of demonstrates, I think that you'll be able to get an idea here in a moment of what a wicked problem is, even if you could, I recommend that everyone interested in these issues check out that book. So one of these elements of a wicked problem here up in towards the top, every problem is unique, and that's certainly true here, and I hope to drive that home today. There's no clear definition of the problem, and that's definitely true in this case. And in fact, we have a lot of situations where different people disagree on what the problem actually is, and that ties into this other element, multiple stakeholders with conflicting agendas. We have many cases where, for example, environmental protection may be at odds with intervening to save a homeowner's house from getting eroded away. You could say, well, we should just protect this stream, but if you let the stream run its course, it may end up destroying a house or something like that. So how do you deal with those sorts of situations? And of course, another element of this is that every wicked problem is connected to others. And so these are interconnected, very complex, unique problems without a definite solution. And so it's like, wow, that seems pretty impossible. But you know what, that's pretty much land use in general in a nutshell, and certainly water management. So we have to kind of accept that everyone's never going to be happy. And that we have to find the best case scenario in a wide variety of settings. So one area where data can help, of course, is figuring out how likely a project is to succeed. And so one thing that can help come to compromise is if we select this most optimal solution. So right now, the TMDL credits, or the credits that are being issued for TMDLs for stream restoration are based off of, in large part, off of this technical report here. But there's a little bit of a problem, and that is that this report, which was completed, I think, 6 years ago, only includes 6 studies, and they're all from Maryland and Pennsylvania. And I'm going to first off start by saying that's just the way that it is. That was the data. The task was to figure out how well does stream restoration work, and those were the data available, and so that's what they did. But I think that this is less. So I would just focus on with this as with many things. There are lots of shortcomings with everything we do, but we're doing the best with what we have on the ground. But we should have more, and I'm going to argue for why we need more. So these are the locations of the 6 studies, and the only reason why we have 6 is because some practitioners, including Biohabitats up in Baltimore, spent a lot of extra money to collect data at those sites around Baltimore where they did restoration, in many cases doing more than they had to. And so we could actually have less data than this. But what you can see is that it's really hard to develop reliable stream restoration credits for this entire large watershed. So this red outline is the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and those 6 blue pins are the 6 locations of those sites. And I'm sure you can see immediately that's an issue. How do you determine the restoration effectiveness of every stream restoration project in the Chesapeake Bay watershed off of 6 sites? It's pretty difficult. And to drive home why this is difficult, it's because, remember I said a minute ago, every problem's unique. Well, a big part of that is environmental conditions are very different across the Chesapeake Bay watershed. What we see in Piedmont, Virginia is very different than the coastal plain of Maryland, and it's very different than the conditions you see up in Pennsylvania. And so you can see that here on this, this is based off of USDA soil maps of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And you can see that we have a huge amount of variability. In the coastal plain, there's a lot more silt, sandy loam, things like that. But as you move up into the Piedmont and the mountain ridge and valley regions, you don't really get, it doesn't get any simpler. So you're just getting more variability. And so we then can pile on other things. We have these hydrogeomorphic regions as well. And so beyond soil type changing, we also see that the topology is very different. And that's of course controlling soil, but it's adding additional complexity. And so we need to do a lot of planning to design a stream restoration. But right now, in many cases, we don't really have enough data to know what scenario is going to be most likely to work where. And in fact, we're basing most of our decisions off of just a handful of studies because that's what we've budgeted for. And we see the same thing with stormwater ponds. So there are a lot of different kinds of stormwater ponds or stormwater pond adjacent type structures. So on the top left, there's a dry pond. And so that's a pond, and you can see there's a riser there in the middle. And these are ponds that are usually dry and they're designed to retain water. And that's generally an older design. Wet ponds were introduced later. And so these are ponds with excess storage capacity, but they remain wet all the time. And you can see that they are usually mown down to the edge. And that is something that's been pointed out as an issue. Of course, they do have to, in many cases, be dredged to maintain their capacity to hold sediment. But the habit of mowing up to the edge is not necessary. And it's something that folks at the University of Florida have been emphasizing, that there are a lot of options here for what we can do around the edges of these wet ponds. But wet ponds are generally a slightly newer technology, and the wet pond allows for high residence time of saturated sediment. So there's wet sediment there at the bottom, and there's water sitting there for a long time, and that provides some nutrient treatment benefits that you don't get out of a dry pond. You don't get that same processing in just a plain old dry pond. And then we also have wetland basins, and so that's kind of taking this approach like I talked about and adding vegetation. And you can even have emergent vegetation throughout the pond depending on strategies, regulations, etc. And then we have bioretention cells. And they are also called bioswales. A lot of times they're also referred to as rain gardens. I think that there's a little bit of a difference between a true bioretention cell and a rain garden, but they're certainly pretty adjacent. And so it's kind of a mixture of a lot of these different technologies where they are dry a lot of the time, but they're taking this wetland bioplant strategy as well as having water retaining capacity, just in a much smaller unit. So you have to have more of them, and I'll talk about that in a bit. So for stormwater pond data, we do have more data, but we don't have enough to evaluate effectiveness. So these are some these are from some comprehensive BMP data sets, and these are the number of sites that are actually useful for looking at uptake. And what that means is that there are studies where both water coming into the basin or stormwater pond was measured, and water coming out of the stormwater pond was being measured. And that's important because a lot of the time when you're looking for regulatory outcomes, you just measure what's coming out at the bottom of the pond. And if the water quality is good, that's good. If the water quality is bad, that's bad. But when you want to evaluate the capacity of a project to retain nutrients, for example, or retain sediment, you need to look at what's coming in and coming out so that you can find out what the watershed's delivering, because that can be very variable. So we need this certain kind of project, and I'll show some pictures of that in a minute to help emphasize that. But I just want to point out that this is not all of the studies that are available. These are all of the studies that have these sort of specific match data that folks like myself can use for modeling retention. And so what you can see is that we don't have representation for a lot of different kinds of stormwater projects in this system. Can folks hear me? I just saw that chat from Michael, and I want to make sure that I'm not.
It just
Okay,
came
great.
back.
Thank you. Awesome.
Good.
Yeah, so I will admit my internet it's been great I've been doing lots of remote teaching just like everyone else, and been having this happen intermittently. So hopefully it won't happen again. But we'll keep our fingers crossed. I think I'm gonna make sure actually my phone is turned off as well. Minimize interference. So you can see the issue. We need to have a full representation of data for all of these different regions, all of these different states, and even for various areas within states. And yet for Maryland, these database bioretention pond data or bioretention cell data, and even in Virginia, where there is a full coverage of these kind of 4 basic categories, there's not really as much replication as we'd like to see, of course, because when you're thinking about, well, we measured 3 bioretention projects across all of Virginia. Virginia is a big state. And the reason why there are more studies from Virginia is because folks at University of Virginia and VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University, have been getting funding, and they've been doing studies and contributing their data. And so we have this kind of ad hoc situation here. As well. And so certain areas get studied really well and other areas get little or no study. So why don't we have more data? As I said, the process is ad hoc. You have to be motivated to go find money to conduct a study. And I mentioned before that expert panel that put together that report for that estimated stream restoration nutrient uptake. Well, these expert panels aren't convened very often because they're very pricey if you have to pay everyone for a lot of work, or as is often the case, experts are volunteering their time as service. And so folks are actually sitting on these panels for little or no money. And so people don't want to volunteer for that all of the time because they need to be doing the job that gets them paid as well. And so it's great that folks are even doing this at all, but it's a system where because we haven't prioritized this sort of data collection and this data-driven approach, it's something that we do in this very ad hoc manner. And I would argue that first of all, this optimization requires good data. And so you're probably wondering why I have a picture of a broken TV and a picture of a stream restoration. Well, it's to point out something about why optimization requires good data. If you want to know, if you buy a TV and you want to know if it works, all you have to do is turn it on. And if you turn it on and it looks like this one, then you know that the TV's not working. And so I'm not saying that this stream restoration, by the way, is working or not working. It's just a picture of it. But the point is that you can't just look at that stream restoration and say whether it's accomplishing its goals or not. It requires a lot of time and a lot of money to do that. But if you're working in a market-based system, or you're trying to optimize something to find the greatest cost effectiveness per dollar spent, you need that information. Markets rely on full information, and we don't really have that here. Of course, there's good reasons for that, but I would argue that we'll have better outcomes if we do spend this money up front. And so here's an example from a report that was submitted to Howard County last September. So this is pretty new, looking at how the act of actually constructing a wetland can doing a stream restoration or stream construction how that impacts biology and discharge of sediment. So as you can see, when you have construction equipment operating in a stream, there's going to be an inevitable loss of sediments. And so Howard County had these folks go out and study this. And this is their sample schematic. And what you can see here is that this was a fair amount of work. They've got multiple benthic sampling stations for biology. They're collecting water quality up here above where the project is. They're collecting water quality here in the middle. They're collecting water quality again at the bottom. And so you're collecting a lot of data at all of these sites. It takes time to collect. It takes money to analyze those samples. And it takes money to collect the data, especially if you want to know not just your concentration, but how much stuff was going by. That means you need to know how much water is going by, and that can be that's actually fairly challenging. The U.S. Geological Survey does that stream gauging around the United States, and their cost is about $15,000 a year per station to maintain those stations, just to maintain water discharge at one spot. And it's worth it because not only do scientists use that for various kinds of research, but it's very important for flood mapping, flood prevention, things like that. And so we've decided that that's worth it. But it's worth noting that if you want to really understand the hydrology of your system, even for just a fairly short amount of time, you're going to be paying for it. So we do want to be aware of these costs, but I would argue that we can make these costs pay off in the long run. So we do have a data poor system situation right now, though. So I worked on this project where we tried to leverage expert judgment. We said, okay, we don't have enough data to look at how much nitrogen every stormwater pond type is retaining. And we also looked at some more recent technology, such as regenerative stormwater conveyances that I'll talk about in a minute. And so where at the time of this study in particular, there's almost no research done on them. They're very new. There's now, I'm happy to report there's a growing amount of research on those and other systems. So folks are starting to do this, but I would argue that we can do a lot more. And this is an example of why I think that we can't just, why we can't take a shortcut around that, because that's basically what we tried here. Is we said, okay, what if we take experts and we can use them to enhance the data that we already have to find out about what's going on in data poor situations. And we used an approach that was developed in the 80s to estimate the risk tolerances of nuclear power plants. You don't want to induce a nuclear meltdown at a nuclear power plant just to see point you can stop stressing a nuclear power plant. So that's the kind of experiment you never want to do. And so instead, our collaborator Roger Cook came up with a method of using expert judgment, where experts were given questionnaires, and some of the questions we knew the answers to, and some of the questions we didn't know the answers to. And so we calibrated the experts' responses based on how good they did on the questions where we knew the answers to. We said, okay, well that person's answers must be better across the board, and so they're weighted further. And so we looked at a couple pretty well studied systems. One in the coastal plain of Maryland in Anne Arundel County. The other was up in the Piedmont of Maryland. And so the first thing that we did is we just tried to get an estimate of nitrogen loads. And this on the x-axis is cut off, but that's rainfall events in inches. And so this is how much nitrogen, and that's kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, is being released from these different watersheds across these different rain events that we had them produce estimates for. And what we found, and this is well supported by the data, is that first of all, there's a real big difference in responsiveness here, where the Piedmont system was was potentially, though I'll note that we didn't have, so this was Hurricane Irene here, this 10-inch event. And so unfortunately, the coastal plain, we didn't have Hurricane Irene data. But there's a suggestion here that coastal plain was actually less prone to flushing out nitrogen during storm events. So, and we really only saw that flushing in the Piedmont systems. But then when we tried to look at nutrient retention efficiency for all of these different systems, using this expert judgment, what we found is that we don't really know. So we've got 5 different types of systems here. We've got those bioretention cells. The RSC is the regenerative stormwater conveyance structures that I talked about before. These are kind of hybrid headwater stream stormwater BMP projects. We had dry ponds as well. And what you can see is that the bioretention cells and the regenerative stormwater conveyances seem to have much higher total nitrogen removal efficiency than any of the pond systems. And dry ponds seem to perform a little bit worse than wet ponds. But take a look at those error bars. That represents the uncertainty with our answer. Our experts helped a little bit, but the uncertainty with our estimates was still huge, to the point where, so that red dashed line, I've actually added that. We should have had that in the original paper, but we didn't. That red line, that's where you have 0 removal efficiency. And so below that, that's actually where these systems become net sources of nitrogen. So instead of sucking up nitrogen, there are cases where they could actually be releasing nitrogen. And that has been seen in the past, particularly for dry ponds. I mentioned that they're older style technology with less capability for retaining nutrients because they're not wet all the time. And so that is actually seen in real life. So I think that these general results are true, but it also points out that there's a huge amount of variability. And this comes from the fact that at any given location, the local environmental factors will change which kind of strategy is the best. And right now, we don't really have the information to choose which is the best strategy. The objective of this paper was to say, of this study, I should say, was to say, okay, well, so these red dots are, by the way, these are the coastal plain systems, and then the black dots are the Piedmont systems. And so the idea was, well, we were trying to find where these systems work better, and can we use the coastal plain versus the Piedmont to say, okay, well, we want to do wet ponds in the Piedmont maybe, and in the coastal plain we should have more bioretention cells or whatever, what have you. And what we found is we didn't have enough information to give a recommendation, either by region or by project type, with any real strong confidence. And so that's unfortunate, but it gives us an opportunity here going forward to collect some more data. And certainly it does, I would say that these results also were hopeful, because we did see, so bioretention cells and regenerative stormwater conveyances are kind of a next generation technologies where they're taking some ideas that were present in the past, or that have been added since these earlier projects existed, and are trying to advance the field. And we did see some suggestions that they work better, but we still need to know a lot more about when and where that's the case. So where do we go from here? I'm gonna take us on a little tour of the watershed here for the last part of this presentation. I'm gonna start with how things were a long time ago. And this is from some work that Grace Brush at Johns Hopkins University has done. And oh, sorry about that. You know, Michael, I'm just gonna the brakes and answer that question. Yeah, so but that's a great point. That the older BMP projects, so those were all relatively new BMPs at the time. The stormwater ponds were relatively new as well. But that's absolutely a weakness, is that we have older and newer types of all of these technologies. We have all of these different regions, all of these different soil types. And so it's really hard to compare apples to apples. And we end up comparing apples to oranges and trying to use these tricks to shoehorn and get the best response that we can. But the rules are changing, even if sometimes we don't think it's fast enough, and that's a major issue. So that's a great point. And yeah, I mean, in retrospect, I think that we realized that we were probably pretty audacious to try and even do the that we're audacious to try and do that project and expect to get any meaningful results. But we did it anyway. And so this is some great work. Grace Brush at Johns Hopkins University has been a leader in this area, and she's looked at some paleo work. So using soil cores and things like that to look back in time to see what was the landscape like before colonization. And what she has found is that most of where we lived were wetlandscapes. Beaver were everywhere. They were making ponds everywhere, and just everything was soggy. So just any low-lying area would have a lot of water. All of these low-lying areas are great for retaining nitrogen. They're great for retaining sediment. There wasn't much being supplied because there wasn't any impervious surface yet. But if there had been, they would have been great at retaining it. So of course, the ironic thing is that at the same time that we remove all of those ponds that are great at retaining sediment and nutrients, we're also adding more nutrients and adding more impervious surfaces. And so that's flushing water off the land more quickly and delivering nutrients more quickly to our waterways, which we're trying to avoid. And so that's where things like bioretention cells come into play. Is basically these kinds of strategies are trying to recreate a lot of the things about a forested beaver pond. So you can see it's great to have plants in them. There's some gravel here. There's a gravel bed for drainage, but in between that, there's actually hardwood mulch. There's various plants and trees with roots, and so these plants are retaining a lot of nutrients, and the hardwood mulch is supplying a carbon source, food for microbes, and microbes can do additional retaining of these nutrients as well. And so it's basically, the idea here is to create a better beaver pond in a lot of ways, something that has some retention capacity for water so that it can prevent flooding. It has retention capacity for nutrients. It's designed to maximize that based on what we've learned over the last years. And these things are smaller than stormwater ponds as well, and so they're much more distributed. And so Mike Roban was nice enough to share this slide, and so I thought I would show it here. This is some construction of a bioretention pond. And so in this report that Michael shared with me, there were two scenarios, and one is you can have 75 stormwater ponds, these much larger structures, or you can shrink down and you can have 830 bioretention cells. And so in that case, you're distributing things much more across the landscape, and that has a lot of benefits as well. You're also, if one individual structure fails, you're not taking as much of a hit. And of course, they're also a lot more aesthetic this way as well. And so there are a lot of benefits to bioretention cells. And in fact, cities like New York City have really hopped on board with these sorts of distributed systems. And so now if you're walking down the street in Brooklyn and you come to a street corner, a lot of times the curb will be a tiny, small bioretention cell with a plant, or with a tree planted in it, rather than just a bit of lawn or just impervious sidewalk like everywhere else. And other cities like Portland and Pittsburgh have really been getting into this as well. And so there's interesting possibilities with these systems. But as you can imagine, figuring out the aggregate effect of all of these distributed systems. I've been talking about how expensive it is to collect data. Well, this just makes figuring out how to optimize these things that much more difficult. So there certainly are issues, of course. And so here is a cross-section of a regenerative storm conveyance structure. And so the idea here is that we have all these headwater streams that have been extremely incised. And so we want to get rid of that incised channel, but we want to keep as much nutrient and water retention as possible when you're dealing with this incised channel. And so what they've done here is, first of all, they've introduced this sort of step pool channel. And let's see here. Sorry, there's a picture of this coming up. But so hopefully you can capture what's going on here. So water is coming in from the left, and it hits these pools. And then the idea is that, except at very high flows, you have water infiltrating into these rock veins, and that slows down the water a lot because you're creating this pooling. And so if you just had, of course, the rock veins serving as a buffering capacity, you probably wouldn't slow down the water a whole lot. But because we're creating these isolated pools, that is actually slowing down the water a lot. And so what you can see as well is that what's beneath these rock veins isn't just cobbles or gravel, it's a sand/wood chip mix. And so like I mentioned before, researchers have found that microbes work a lot better if they have food, and microbes like to eat things like carbon sources like wood chips. And so the folks who designed this said, well, let's give the microbes the food that they need. And the early results now are showing that, in fact, it is increasing microbial activity, and the microbes are retaining more nitrogen. And it remains to be seen. It's still, I think there's still some work to see if they can remove that nitrogen. Nitrogen is removed via denitrification, which is also a microbial process. But different kinds of microbes need to do it. And some of the early results are showing that it's not denitrifying bacteria that are showing up, but it's more bacteria that consume nitrogen and then hold on to it. So there's a concern that these systems could eventually just they can keep sucking up nitrogen, but at some point they could start being less retentive if they get filled up, essentially. And so that's an issue, but it's also an opportunity. Something that I'll point out, I'm gonna talk about this again, is that these are opportunities. Every time that we find a shortcoming or things didn't work quite the way we expected, that's an opportunity to advance ourselves. And in fact, that's what we see a lot in industry. For example, with automakers. You didn't see, for example, with automakers, when they came out with anti-lock brakes, automakers weren't embarrassed that they didn't have anti-lock brakes before. They advertised, now we have anti-lock brakes, we have safer cars, and then they charged more for it as well. And so I think that we could take that lesson into mind here where creating these sorts of advances with a data-driven approach is going to allow us to create new successes that we can brag about. So I'm excited about these sorts of systems, and I'm excited that we're seeing increasing amounts of research and collaboration between a lot of different stakeholders to make these projects even better. So another option that you have for protecting stuff. So this is so I should say the bioretention cells and stormwater ponds. Those are up in the watershed. So these are up in the land, and now with this riparian zone, we're moving closer to the stream. And so a major strategy is protecting or planting riparian zones. They can be hugely effective at retaining nutrients. And so the USDA, this is a photo from the USDA, and they spend a lot of money on conservation programs to keep these sorts of riparian zones in place. But as with everything, riparian zone, with everything, I argue that science can give us more more bang for the buck. So this is a cutaway here of a riparian zone from back in 1977. So also, I'm just going to back up. I talk about streams all the time, and I'm a big nerd, so I know what a riparian zone is. All that a riparian zone means is it's that area immediately around a stream. It's not really well defined, and that's kind of an issue that we deal with, is that the riparian zone, just at some point it's not riparian anymore, but you could probably find 20 different definitions of that. And so we're always arguing about how wide should this riparian zone be in order to maximize the nutrient retention effectiveness, sediment retention effectiveness, maximize the benefits of these riparian zones. And one of the issues is what's going on that we can't see. So like I talked about before, you don't necessarily, you can't necessarily look at a stream and know how well it's functioning from a nutrient retention or sediment standpoint. Because water coming in could follow this flow path here. So this is a shallower flow path. And a lot of times it's these shallow flow paths through these stream bank riparian zones where a lot of nutrients are removed. And so you really want that to happen. But what researchers have found is that sometimes this happens, but also sometimes that happens. And so the water takes a different flow path. You can't tell from looking at the surface, but it's actually missed that area entirely where you wanted the water to go. And so in that case, maybe you don't get the same level of nitrogen retention that you were getting before. And so folks like Don Weller and Tom Jordan have done a lot of work on this. And they found that, for one thing, it varies by physiographic province. And so they're looking at cropland here, but this is true for other systems too, probably. But we have more data from cropland, so I'm going to go there. And so you can see that so CP is coastal plain, PD is Piedmont, and AM is the Appalachian Mountain Province. And what you can see is that how much nitrogen is being retained is really different depending on where you are. To the point where it looks like you're getting a lot more benefit perhaps in the Piedmont, whereas if you do these sorts of riparian protections in the coastal plain, you're not going to get, or in the mountain regions, you're not going to get as much retention. And the reason why they highlighted that this may be the case is because of these different flow paths. So the flow paths, and they also highlighted though that this is very, very general. And so individual streams in the Piedmont may look more like a coastal plain stream or more like an Appalachian mountain stream. We need to find those variables that tell us where are we going to get this big amount of retention versus not. And this is important because right now we just have a one-size-fits-all strategy. We always have riparian boundaries at the same width. And a lot of folks argue that we should make them wider. They're not really retaining enough, and we could retain a lot more. But a great compromise would be to figure out where we can get additional benefit by widening the riparian zones, and where maybe they're wide enough already, or we're not going to get much additional benefit by widening them. And the best way to do that is to take this data-driven approach. And so the last thing that I'm going to do is talk a little bit more about sediment and why this is such a why this makes everything that I just talked about much more complicated. So folks have been looking at sediment related to urbanized development for quite a while. Reds Woolman, who was a pioneering geomorphologist and hydrologist, did a lot of work in the DC area in the 60s, 70s, 80s, I think even into the 90s. He had a very long, prestigious career and did a lot of really great work that hasn't been replicated in many cases since. And so he was looking at how does development change sediment loads to streams. And so your starting position when you're developing a new project is you have probably this system that may have some of this legacy sediment. It may not, but it looks perhaps something like this. Well, then we're going to do some development, and that development is going to start sending that chocolate milk downstream. And that's going to leave behind some infill in many cases. And then we have another storm event come through, and it's going to maybe cut out a bit of the sediment, but then it's going to dump even more the next time. But the important thing to note here is that it's not the same sediment. We're scouring out, we're dumping sediment, we're scouring out sediment, we're placing even more sediment. And so it actually looks like we've added sediment, but a lot of it's brand new. Or I should say a lot of the sediment that we think is old is also brand new. And so these systems can be very, very static over time, but the actual sediment that's there is turning over. But the important thing to note is it's not how much sediment is turning over necessarily, it's the net sediment retention. There's always going to be sediment moving through, but it's how much is being retained and how much is being supplied to the stream. So an interesting thing happens when you finish development, and that is that in a lot of cases, the sediment supply actually goes down. So while you're developing, they do their best, but in many cases, silt fences and things like that will fail. And so you have a lot of sediment being supplied when you have these denuded landscapes. But once you add impervious cover, you have a lot more concrete, you have a lot more lawns that aren't really huge sources of sediment. And so you can see that in this picture, the water going down this storm drain during this pretty big rain event is very clear. It's not delivering sediment downstream. And so what happens here, this is where the sediment incision happens. This is where the sediment loss really happens. You get this incision of the stream, because now we're sending water very quickly into the stream and we're not sending any sediment to add on to it. And so you have basically a double whammy where you both have fast water scouring out sediment and nothing to replace it. And that's really where these systems start to become unstable and where the banks start to become a source of sediment. It's because you've lost that sediment supply in the watershed. And so this is an interesting work done by Sean Smith, Peter Wilcock, who have both worked extensively in the Maryland area. This is up in Pennsylvania. This is maybe a little bit of a confusing figure, but the idea here is that sediment supply varies throughout the watershed. And so they have here upland supply. And so the first thing I'll draw your attention to is that they say, so forest is down here around 100, but then suburban sediment supply is higher. And I've cut out the caption here, but they're using, in this case, USDA data. But the USDA data does not differentiate between uplands and small zero-order channels. And so when they actually broke up the data between the zero-order channels, which we would really probably think of as being these, these zero streams here, when they actually broke those up, they found that the zero-order channels were a source of sediment, but that even the suburban landscape was actually a net sink of sediment. And in fact, it was as a result of that, because the sediment delivery now is lower than the sediment erosion here, that's where the source is. But it's this kind of unintuitive situation where you can actually end up having more sediment erosion, more downcutting of your stream once you cut off this upland sediment supply. And that's because of these long, also because of these long response times with these systems. So you cut off the supply, and that's going to have a big delayed effect at how that incision happens. One other thing I'll notice is that crops here are off the charts in terms of sediment loss. So we talk about suburban areas as maybe they're a sediment source, though even the authors of this paper would say that this is a bit misleading. But it's really ag fields where you're seeing a large amount of sediment being supplied. And it's really even, you'll notice that this is sediment yield, milligrams per kilometer squared per year. The sediment yield, it's way more than these first and second and third order stream banks, which are often vilified as being a big source of sediments. it's ag systems that are really causing a lot of problems. Of course, our options when working with agricultural systems are much more limited. The ag fields are generally exempt from the Clean Water Act, for example. So here's an example also of how this can play out. That's close to home for me. So this is near West Lafayette in Indiana, land that's owned by Purdue. And so this is Indian Creek, and it's a stream that has a very forested watershed. So down the bottom left corner here, you see that star. And the watershed, I didn't have time to draw the watershed map, but some of these ag fields are included here. I'll just draw you a little picture. That's about your watershed here. There we go, some art. And so I'll note, first of all, that you can see these fingers here, up here, of forest, and that's because the riparian zone's being protected for a lot of these streams. In this case here, you can see that's a stream that's now an ag field. So not all of them are protected. A zero order stream, it's obviously dry right now, but it's an intermittent stream. But then a lot of them are protected. Okay, so this is interesting because the other thing is that nothing's changed in this watershed for decades. And yet all of a sudden in the last 5 or 10 years, this stream has started to erode further and further down. And what I believe is happening is that we've actually done a pretty good job of protecting this system from additions of sediment, but we still get high flows that flush out sediment that's in the channel. And so, especially coming off of these agricultural fields. And so as a result, sediment is being eroded and it's not being replaced. And so unfortunately, so I'm pretty new at Purdue, and unfortunately before I showed up, they went and did this, which I think maybe is not the best move. This isn't the best photograph of it either, my apologies. But what they did is a in-channel stream restoration. And my concern here is that the problem was not actually with the stream channel excessively eroding, but because the stream channel was out of equilibrium. And so I've shown a lot of kind of wild figures, not wild, you know, but complicated figures, and talked about some complex stuff. And so I'm just going to step back here for a moment and show you a picture of what I mean. Oops. Excuse me, drawing on my video. There we go. Got to turn off the pen. And so this is a stream actually out in Arizona, and I was out there a few months ago for some work. And I took this picture because, so you can see my boot there on the left. And so this is a very tiny channel, but it's showing you how dynamic and yet how not dynamic at the same time sediment is in streams. We call this dynamic equilibrium. So if you look, this is in slow motion now. If you look at individual sediment particles here in this video, so you'll notice this ripple here. So I'll draw this. So see that there's the size of those ridges is not really changing, but if you follow individual particles of sediment, they arrive, stick around for a short amount of time, and then keep going. And yet, because of dynamic equilibrium, the shape of these ridges is maintaining the same. But what you can see is they are also migrating downstream. So I drew a line, and now they've maintained their same shape, but they're moving down, but much more slowly than the sediment. Any individual particle of sediment here is moving much more quickly, but these structures here are maintained in equilibrium and move much more slowly. And so that's dynamic equilibrium. And this is really on a micro scale what is happening in every urbanized stream. And so what you can imagine here, and I'll try and clear off my pen, erase pen. All right, so what you can imagine is what happens if, so you don't change anything, you don't speed up the water at all, you don't change the size of the channel, but you stop the supply of sediment from upstream. Sediment's going to keep getting removed from this local area, but there's not going to be any new sediment to replace it. And so what you're going to have is a gradual incision, even if you don't increase the scouring flows at all. And so this is an example of why dealing with sediment is such a tough issue, is that you have to deal with both this supply and demand question as well as the power of the water to erode. And if you don't solve both of those problems, then your project can be unstable. But of course, over a time frame that can be quite extended, of course. And so that's the other problem, is that it can take 10 years or so before you know that you need to go in and do further intervention. And so we need ways to quickly and affordably figure out when we need to make those sorts of interventions, and how we can be more robust to these sorts of problems in the first place. And so just another example of how dynamic these systems are. So this is the river in Peru, and this is Landsat satellite imagery from 1985 to 2013. And this is showing how this sediment movement and this transformation is natural. This is an undisturbed landscape, and yet over the course of a few decades, the river's migrating quite a bit. And you're seeing this dynamic equilibrium as well, where those sandbars there, they're kind of they're changing shape, but they're generally sticking around in the same place. So water's rushing by, sediment's being deposited and then scoured away in the same place. And so that's why you see that those point bars, like we have here, the sediment comes and goes, but the shape of that bar stays the same for an extended period of time. And so that's just to demonstrate that this is something that happens all over the world all the time, and it's not something that we can or really want to change. So the other problem with working in the channel is that when you work in the channel, you are going to release sediment, you're going to release other things. And so this is from that Howard County study that I mentioned before. And so Howard County had this firm go out and measure how much more turbidity, so how much more sediment was the stream transporting because of the construction project. And so they looked at both wet and dry construction. So dry construction is where they're working on the stream banks, and the wet construction is when they're actually in the channel itself. And so what you can see is that they both release. So here they're using turbidity as a measure of sediment transport, how much sediment's being moved. And what you can see is that both kinds of work will release sediment, but in different ways. The wet work, which they ironically made brown. I probably would have switched the colors here if this were me. But the wet work here in brown, you'll notice that it's a sustained sediment flux because they're rolling around in the channel, things are becoming destabilized, and sediment's moving downstream. That's a good question. Is turbidity a good measure of sediment? You have to do a lot of calibration. They did that in this case. So that was a big part of this study. Was they collected a bunch of sediment samples, and then they correlated those to turbidity, and they actually did find that there wasn't a really great correlation, and that's a standard problem, but it's certainly not. It's the best that we can do. So that is actually typically academic research labs use the same approach, and we wring our hands a lot because we really have to collect a lot of samples to get the sensor data even close to calibrated right. So with that in mind, that these turbidity measures are an imperfect measure of sediment, which is true of pretty much every sensor, unfortunately. We see that the in-channel work really has a lot more of a sustained effect, whereas with the dry work, what you're seeing is that when you have these when you have some particular event happen, you can have sediment that's mobilized come down, but otherwise, you can see that that the pattern, that the impact is significant, but that the pattern's really different, and instead sediment is in these pulses. But in both cases, both the wet and the dry work are pushing sediment downstream. And so that's something that we often don't have the resources to calculate, but we should be including it in our assessment, is the amount of extra sediment that we've released just by doing the project, because the project then has that much more. You want, in order for a project to have a net benefit, it has to also overcome any detrimental impacts that it has first, before you can even start getting to net benefits. We also have an issue here in that if you're going to remove a riparian zone, and so if you're going to remove a riparian zone and then you want to plant some new trees in there because you've reconfigured a riparian zone, well, sometimes you got to put in some fertilizer. And so this is a photograph from Will Eleanor. It's a wetland stream sort of restoration. It's a hybrid of both, where they created a lot of intermingling channels, and there's lots of wetland plants, but it required a lot of reconfiguration. And so in order to get plants to grow quickly, they applied fertilizer at first. And so there's some bags of fertilizer there that wouldn't have been in that watershed except for the project. And so it's something to be mindful of with these projects, is that they have their own impacts. And the closer you get to the stream, the harder it is to mitigate the negative impacts of your construction work. And so this is finally, and so this is Mike Rolban drew this to my attention, and this is a great summary here of the cost effectiveness of different kinds of stormwater, of different kinds of projects to reduce nitrogen pollution to the Chesapeake Bay. And I really appreciate this figure, because it really drives home the fact that stormwater is a very expensive way to remove nitrogen. And even if you do it well, it's a pretty expensive way to remove nitrogen. Things like wastewater treatment plant upgrades, enhanced nutrient programs, native oyster aquaculture, algal turf scrubbing. Of course, that one maybe is a little bit hypothetical, but also cover crops and forest buffers. So one thing I would also note here, though, is that I consider forest buffers in many cases, to me, that's a stormwater strategy. And so it also depends on how you restored / constructed wetlands. You'll notice that's in there. To me, that's a stormwater strategy. And so we can also have to recognize that how we bin these things, how we categorize them, is also an issue. So they were Mike. In the case of Mike had a good question about this this study. So were they? And I'll just back up here and talk about it now. I forget exactly what their conclusions are. I think that their main, so they had a rating curve built essentially to convert NTUs to sediment. But I think that the main point of the study was really that they have these different patterns of impact. But it was, I can share a link with you all to check out that study as well. I found that out when I was doing some research for this presentation. I hadn't seen that before. It's pretty new. Yeah, good question. Cover crops. So I mean, I could do a whole talk on cover crops. So what we hear from farmers is that generally they see more nitrogen with cover crops, but they also tell us that the economics on cover crops for them is a little bit fuzzy. No-till often works pretty well for them. They see an economic benefit as well, but cover crops They have to spend some extra money to put in those cover crops, and even pretty progressive farmers who are focused on retaining soils say that it can be sometimes hard to justify. So that's kind of interesting and points to some opportunities, and I'd be happy to talk about that more. But that also ties into my big point here about this, which is also that stormwater management is more than just nutrient reduction as well. But it's important to think about, why did we build this bioretention cell? It's for preventing flooding. It's for reducing sediment. It's for reducing nitrogen. It also has aesthetic value as well. And so there are a lot of different reasons why we do it. But we want to look at things in a holistic fashion and say, okay, here are all the reasons we're doing it. Here are all the benefits. When and where do the benefits outweigh the negatives? And so I think that once again, it's this data-driven approach that's going to help us cut through the incredible complexity of the natural world and the many, many options that we have when dealing with these systems. And so that kind of ties into a pitch for what I do. So part of my work is lowering the barriers to data collection. So that means affordable sensors and affordable data systems. And so I have a link here to my website, and let's see here. I'm gonna just pop over to this page real quickly because I can show off what I was working with my students this semester. So in the midst of the pandemic, everybody had to go home, and I was teaching a class on sensors. Oh, and I just saw that question. I will, we'll talk about that at the end. And so all these students had to be self-isolating by themselves. And so I sent them, in this case, air quality sensors. Those are a lot easier to put together and deploy when you're stuck at home. And so I sent them all these sensors and had them deploy them. They programmed them, put them together, and then connected them to the internet and to this data dashboard. And so you can go here and you can zoom in, look at the data from all these different sites. Got a table down here as well with all the sites listed as well, and metadata that we call it about it. And oh, have to double click to zoom in. And so you can see that. And so one thing I will note is that every time that you load this page, it's refreshing the data from our databases. It's updating live the sensor data, and so it can be a little bit slow. This was a class project, but this is what we did in about 2 months, self-isolated during the pandemic. These sensors cost about $100 a piece, and we're collecting air quality data. So this sensor data here is on volatile organic carbon. That's a noted air quality. It's a lot of different things are involved in volatile organic carbon, but most of them are bad for our health. And so we've been tracking how air quality has been changing over the course of the pandemic and sharing those data live. But this is something that I did with undergraduate students. We couldn't even meet face-to-face in just a couple months. And so we can build these servers, we can build these data systems, and we can start having our own live citizen science efforts. Managers, I'm sure, would love to have a lot of these tools because we're talking about cost for these sensors to get live data streaming to the web, 50 cents to $3 a month per device, and the devices are $100 or $200 a piece. The alternative right now in industry, in many cases, is a $1,000 to $10,000 device that costs 20 or 30 bucks a month to stream data to the web. So this is an example of what open source and open hardware can do for us right now to really lower the barriers to data collection and start solving that problem. So you know, I'm a scientist. I have my hammer. My hammer's data, but I like to practice what I preach a little bit, and get people the data that I say that they should have. So you could check that data dashboard out yourself. As I said, just do keep in mind that's going to be a little slow. Our funds are limited for this stuff, so the server's not super fast. So 20 or 30 seconds is probably enough. And then once it's loaded, you can zoom in and out of the data very quickly. It's just if you want to change anything else, it can take a little while. So to wrap things up, looks can be deceiving, but data can help. We have complex problems, but we also have a lot of tools in the toolbox. But we need more information to select the best options amongst these many options, these many soil types, and these many regions. But I would argue that in the long run, more data means more effective restoration, can be more economical. We develop new strategies. And if you can spend $1,000 collecting data now, maybe that can allow you to save $10,000 or $100,000 on a project later on. It's also a great opportunity to point to advances. As I mentioned before, we can talk, I think in the environmental world, we're very good about being negative and talking about what's wrong, but we should be talking about also that we're usually when we find out something wrong, that means that we are gonna do it right the next time. And I think that we need to focus on that positive can-do attitude as well. And so that I'd like to thank everyone a lot for taking the time. This is some pristine watershed at Northern Vermont. I thought I'd mix things up a little bit, but thanks a lot for your time, and I'll take any questions